It is a confounding discovery that is rocking the very foundations of what we thought we knew about the origins of civilization.
These are the big questions. I think to answer these, we have to go inside and have a closer look.
Before written history began, before the pyramids rose from the sands of Egypt, and before the great empires of Greece or Rome ever existed, there was one civilization that changed the course of humanity forever. They gave us the first cities, the first written language, the first legal systems, and the blueprint for civilization itself. But here's the mystery that has haunted historians for centuries. Who were the Sumerians? Really? For generations, the answer seemed simple. They were believed to be the direct descendants of the earliest farming communities that had lived in southern Mesopotamia for thousands of years. It was a neat, comfortable explanation that found its way into textbooks around the world. Then modern science asked a question nobody had seriously asked before. What if that story was wrong? In 2022, genetic researchers uncovered evidence that forced historians to rethink one of history's oldest civilizations. Instead of confirming everything we thought we knew, the DNA painted a far more complicated and far more fascinating picture. A picture that suggests the world's first civilization wasn't born from a single people at all. It was created by generations of migration, mixing, and cultural fusion. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Sumerians may have never truly disappeared. To appreciate why this discovery matters, we first have to understand the story everyone believed for nearly 2 centuries. History loves simple beginnings. Egyptians came from the Nile Valley. The Greeks evolved from earlier Aegean cultures. The Romans emerged from the peoples of central Italy. So naturally, historians assumed the Sumerians followed the same pattern. According to the traditional view, they developed directly from the Ubaid culture, a farming society that flourished across southern Mesopotamia between roughly 6,500 and 3,800 BCE. These early farmers transformed an unforgiving landscape into fertile farmland. They dug irrigation canals, built villages, and laid the foundations for everything that came later. It sounded logical. One culture slowly evolved into another. Case closed. Except, history rarely stays that simple. Because even while this explanation dominated textbooks, several strange details refused to fit. The first was their language. Nearly every language spoken on Earth belongs to a family tree. English shares ancestors with German. Spanish and Italian trace back to Latin. Arabic belongs to the Semitic family. Even extinct languages usually have distant relatives. But Sumerian? Nothing. No known ancestors. No sister languages. No surviving cousins. It stands completely alone. Imagine discovering a book written in a language unlike anything humanity has ever spoken before. Now imagine that language appears almost fully developed. That's exactly what happened. The second mystery was even stranger. Writing. Most inventions evolve gradually. You expect to see early experiments, failed attempts, primitive versions before perfection. But when writing appears in the city of Uruk, it arrives astonishingly advanced. Almost as if centuries of development happened somewhere we still haven't found. To archaeologists, these weren't small mysteries. Together they became something known as the Sumerian problem. No one could fully explain where these people came from, or why they seemed so different from everyone around them. For decades, researchers simply accepted that some questions might never have answers. Then genetics entered the conversation. And everything changed. Normally, studying ancient DNA is surprisingly straightforward. Scientists recover bones from ancient graves, extract tiny fragments of preserved DNA, then compare those genetic fingerprints with modern populations. That's how researchers reconstructed the migrations of Neanderthals. It's how they tracked Europe's first farmers. It's how they uncovered forgotten civilizations across Asia and the Americas. But when they tried the same approach with the Sumerians, they hit a wall. Not because archaeologists couldn't find Sumerian cities. Those cities are everywhere. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash. The ruins still stand after thousands of years. The problem wasn't the cities. It was the climate. Southern Mesopotamia is one of the worst places on Earth for preserving ancient DNA. Scorching heat, constant humidity, waterlogged soil. Together, They destroy genetic material long before archaeologists ever arrive. Bone crumbles. DNA shatters. After decades of excavation, researchers were left with an incredible irony. The civilization that invented written records left almost no biological record of itself. Think about that for a moment. The Sumerians documented nearly everything. Business transactions, religious ceremonies, royal decrees, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, even beer recipes. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets survived. We can read their words. We know their kings. We know their myths. We even know the name of history's first known author, a Sumerian woman. Yet the people themselves had almost vanished genetically. It was like hearing someone's voice clearly, but never seeing their face. For years, researchers believed the mystery would remain unsolved forever, until someone proposed an entirely different approach. If the ancient DNA no longer existed, maybe the answer was still alive. Instead of looking for ancient bones, scientists looked at modern people. Specifically, one community living in the marshlands where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet before flowing into the Persian Gulf. The Marsh Arabs. For generations, archaeologists had noticed something remarkable about them. Their homes looked strikingly similar to structures carved into ancient Sumerian artwork. Their reed boats resembled vessels used over 4,000 years ago. Their traditions seemed to preserve echoes of a world that had otherwise disappeared. Could these communities still carry traces of the people who built the first cities? Researchers decided to find out. In 2011, scientists analyzed DNA from more than 100 Marsh Arab men, tracing both their paternal and maternal ancestry. The maternal results looked fairly typical for the Middle East. Nothing unusual. But then they examined the Y chromosome. The genetic line passed almost unchanged from father to son. What they found stunned them. An overwhelming majority shared the same paternal lineage, a branch known as J1p58. Such extreme concentration is incredibly rare. Most populations resemble a colorful mosaic made up of dozens of different paternal lineages. This population looked almost like it had been drawn with a single brushstroke. That alone was fascinating. But what came next was even more surprising. Because scientists weren't only interested in which lineage they carried. They wanted to know where it began. Using genetic variation, researchers traced the deepest roots of this paternal branch. And instead of pointing toward southern Iraq, the trail led somewhere completely different. North, toward upper Mesopotamia, toward southeastern Turkey, with connections stretching toward the Zagros Mountains. Suddenly, the traditional story started to crack. If the closest living relatives of the Sumerians carried a lineage whose deepest origins weren't even in southern Mesopotamia, then maybe the ancestors of civilization hadn't always lived there. Maybe they had arrived from somewhere else. And if that's true, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. When did they arrive, and what were they bringing with them? That answer wouldn't come from archaeology. It would come from a genetic clock. And what that clock revealed forced historians to rethink the birth of civilization itself. So, when did this mysterious bloodline arrive? Scientists realized that DNA carries something extraordinary. A clock. Every generation leaves behind tiny genetic changes. They're almost invisible, but over thousands of years those changes accumulate. By measuring them, researchers can estimate when a particular lineage suddenly expanded across a region. When they applied that method to the dominant J1p58 lineage, one number immediately stood out. Roughly 4,500 years ago. Now think about what else was happening around that exact time. The cities of Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash were exploding into life. Writing had matured. Monumental temples were rising toward the sky. Kings ruled over growing populations. Trade connected distant lands. For the first time in human history, enormous cities were becoming reality. At first glance, the timing seemed almost too perfect. It looked as though the birth of civilization and the rapid expansion of one paternal bloodline were happening side by side. Naturally, headlines rushed to a dramatic conclusion. The Sumerian bloodline has finally been found. But real science rarely works that neatly. And this is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because the researchers themselves urged everyone to slow down. That genetic estimate carried a massive margin of error. Large enough that the expansion could have happened thousands of years before Sumer reached its peak, or even centuries after it had already faded. In other words, the DNA wasn't giving us a final answer. It was giving us another mystery. Instead of proving the identity of the Sumerians, it hinted that something much bigger had been happening across Mesopotamia long before history was ever written. Then came the breakthrough that truly changed everything. In 2022, researchers from Harvard analyzed some of the oldest recoverable genomes from northern Mesopotamia. Unlike the humid south, northern regions preserved enough ancient DNA for scientists to finally examine the people who lived there thousands of years before Sumerian civilization emerged. Everyone expected a simple result. One ancient population. One clear ancestry. Instead, they found a mixture. Not two groups. Not even three isolated peoples. But generations of communities blending together over thousands of years. Some ancestry came from the Levant. Another component traced back toward Anatolia. A major stream flowed from the Caucasus and the Zagros Mountains in what is now western Iran. Suddenly, an entirely different picture appeared. The fertile plains of Mesopotamia weren't producing civilization in complete isolation. They were becoming a meeting place. For centuries, people had been moving, trading, intermarrying, sharing ideas. By the time the first cities appeared, the population living there had already become the product of countless generations of mixing. That realization overturned one of archaeology's oldest assumptions. The Sumerians weren't simply descendants of one isolated farming culture. Nor were they mysterious outsiders who suddenly arrived from another continent. They were something far more remarkable. The result of thousands of years of human interaction. Civilization wasn't born from purity. It was born from connection. But then researchers noticed something almost impossible to ignore. For centuries, Sumerian mythology had repeatedly pointed toward the east. Toward distant mountains. Again and again, ancient stories described sacred highlands where powerful gods lived, and from where the gifts of civilization first came. For generations, historians treated these stories as symbolic myths, religious poetry, nothing more. Yet now, modern genetics pointed in almost the exact same direction, toward the Zagros Mountains. Does that prove the myths were historical memories? No. Not yet. But it creates one of history's most intriguing possibilities. Perhaps those stories weren't trying to explain heaven. Perhaps they were preserving an echo of where some of their ancestors had once come from. Not a detailed memory, just fragments, passed from one generation to another until history transformed them into legend. Sometimes myths preserve truth in ways people never realize. The deeper scientists looked into modern Iraq, the more complicated the story became. The Marsh Arabs weren't unique. Across Iraq, researchers found overlapping genetic foundations shared by many different communities. Assyrians, Mandeans, Iraqi Jews, Arab populations. Despite speaking different languages, following different religions, and living through thousands of years of conquest, many still carried deep genetic roots connected to ancient Mesopotamia. Of course, history had added many new layers. The Akkadians arrived. Then Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans. Every empire left traces behind, especially through male ancestry. But underneath those later chapters, the older Mesopotamian foundation remained, like an ancient city buried beneath newer buildings, invisible from the surface, yet still holding everything up. Which raises an extraordinary possibility. Maybe the Sumerians didn't vanish. Maybe they slowly became everyone who came after them. At this point, it's tempting to believe the mystery has finally been solved. But the most honest part of the story is also the most important. Scientists still don't possess one crucial piece of evidence. Actual DNA from confirmed Sumerian remains in southern Mesopotamia. Without it, every conclusion remains an educated reconstruction. A remarkably convincing one, but still incomplete. Unfortunately, recovering that evidence is incredibly difficult. Many ancient sites lie beneath modern cities. Others remain inaccessible because of decades of political instability. And even if archaeologists gained full access tomorrow, southern Iraq's climate continues destroying DNA faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. Ironically, the civilization that invented written history may forever remain one of the hardest civilizations to study genetically. That uncertainty frustrates researchers. But it also makes the story more exciting. Because science isn't about protecting old answers. It's about following evidence wherever it leads, even when it overturns centuries of accepted history. Perhaps the biggest lesson has nothing to do with the Sumerians alone. For generations, historians searched for pure origins. One people, one birthplace, one uninterrupted bloodline. Ancient DNA keeps telling us something very different. The Egyptians weren't genetically isolated. Neither were the Greeks, or the Romans, or countless other civilizations. Human history has almost always been a story of movement, migration, exchange, adaptation. The world's greatest civilizations weren't built by isolated populations. They emerged where different peoples met, shared ideas, solved problems together, and created something none of them could have built alone. The Sumerians may be the oldest example of that truth. Which brings us back to the question we asked at the very beginning. What happened to the people who created civilization? Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Empires collapsed. Languages disappeared. Kings were forgotten. Temples crumbled into dust. The name Sumer slowly vanished from history. But people rarely disappear that completely. They marry. They migrate. They change languages. They adopt new identities. Generation after generation, they become something new. The Sumerians may have lost their cities, their empire, even their name. But their descendants may still be walking the same land between the Tigris and Euphrates today, not calling themselves Sumerian, not speaking the Sumerian language, yet quietly carrying pieces of one of humanity's oldest civilizations within them. In the end, perhaps civilizations don't truly die. They simply evolve until we stop recognizing them. And maybe that's the greatest surprise of all. The world's first civilization may have never vanished. It may simply have changed its name. If this story changed the way you think about the birth of civilization, let me know in the comments. And here's another question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. Which ancient civilization do you believe still survives today? Not through its monuments, but through the people themselves. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to subscribe, because the next forgotten chapter of history is even more unbelievable than this one.